What's a story or a piece of media you never want to see again? For me, when I was around 6 or 7 years old, I went to a sleepover with a bunch of other boys, and they wanted to watch Saw. And my little fragile 7-year-old brain did not really cope well with seeing that puppet right there. So much that even getting this footage still hurt a little bit. My point is, there are some things you can never unsee. There are many other things that I have seen or read that I don't want to see again, but for very different reasons. Sometimes even stories that are so good, I don't want to go through the effort of reading or watching again because it's just not the same. Sometimes it's a grind with some stories, and sometimes there are stories that I don't want to see because they're so unnerving. In 2017, a mangaka of considerable acclaim, Inio Sano, released a very short one-shot called Downfall. It's a story about a mangaka called Fukuzawa who just finished his smash success series, and he is now trying to figure out what to make next. And it's because of that success that he is pressured by every single person around him to come up with something. His fans are constantly asking him on social media what he's making next. His editor is constantly harassing him about what ideas he's got. And his wife, who is also an editor for a different mangaka artist, constantly tells him to read some other manga and get some inspiration. Especially the one that she keeps having meetings with every single day, leaving no time for him because she's so busy with work with this mangaka that she won't stop talking about. Interesting. So instead of doing all these things, Fukuzawa decides to just, waste his days in his office, doing nothing. He just tells his editors when they ask for what work to do to just draw some backgrounds for something that he might use, for an idea that he hasn't even come up with. And in the evenings after work, he goes to love hotels and he engages with women who don't have any clue who or what he is. It's a snippet of someone in their life who has spent so much of their time working on something and trying to create it that when they got to where they were and succeeded, they started to wonder what it was all even for in the first place. Similar to how if you were to eat a whole bucket of KFC and there you are sitting at 2 AM on the toilet wondering if it was really worth it. Inio Sano is a mangaka known for creating some of the most realistic characters in the medium and having a sense of realism even if the stories are not that realistic. The stories he portrays and what the stories are trying to say are extremely true, extremely realistic, and can be extremely confronting. Some of his most notable works are Goodnight Punpun, Solanin, and a manga title that I'm all too happy to read out loud, Dead Dead Demons Dead Destruction. Apart from the weird surrealistic titles and little birds trying to get horny turning into triangles, Downfall was a story that I really liked, but I would not ever want to read again. The last panel was just so spine-shivering to me that if you were to ask me if I wanted to read it all again, even though it's on my bookshelf over there, I'd probably say no. And if you want to see that panel, well, you gotta wait till the end of the video. These stories aren't really entertainment first. They can be entertaining, they can make you laugh for a bit, but ultimately they're trying to say something that might be not what you want to hear when you're not having a great day. And some of these stories are the ones that I want to talk about today, that in my eyes are manga that you can't really read again for various reasons. To start off with one of these series, I have to talk about endings. The ending of a series can really make or break a storyline. Hours upon hours of character development, dialogue, and plot points all culminate in an ending. And some endings are so bad that they can ruin a story's whole pace, and in some worst cases, the entire point of the story. It also really depends on the expectations that the plot has given the audience. And depending on those, and depending on what the goal of the story is, it can really make or break a series. One of my favorite manga is 20th Century Boys. I've made a video on this channel before about 20th Century Boys, and I've actually criticized this series ending. But if you had to ask me if I would want to read this all over again from the beginning, I don't know if I'd want to. If you haven't read it, it's a great story about, realistically, how would someone take over the world, and how would a small group of people stop them? The villain is one of the most interesting parts of the story because their identity is shrouded in mystery from chapter 1. But the threads of trying to figure out who it is really cool, because it's implied it's someone from the main character's childhood, someone they used to play with. So a lot of the plot in the series is trying to figure out who he is. Who is Friend? A lot of the characters are separate in this storyline, each trying to find their own clues to the same question. And so as the omniscient reader, you get to watch every single person's perspective and slowly piece together the puzzle of who Friend could be. That's one of the exciting things about it, and I'd still recommend reading it. But for someone who has read it and has gotten to the ending and has found out this person's identity, I would have to say it's similar to laying out a puzzle on the table, and you've put all the pieces together. In fact, you've got every single piece on that table and it fits perfectly, except the last piece. The ending of this series and the reveal of the identity is something that I think quite literally falls down the stairs. The story is good enough to read regardless. The whole middle of this story is unbelievable. In fact, the first part of the ending is great, but the overall ending of figuring out who this character is like a puzzle piece that does fit, but it's a piece for a completely different puzzle. You can look at it, it fits, but it doesn't match the puzzle piece that's been laid out on the table. Knowing the piece doesn't fit, knowing that as many times as you break apart the puzzle piece and you reread it all again and you put all the pieces back together, it still doesn't fit. Would you want to read it again? It's one of the things that does perplex me, because there are moments where I go back and look at these chapters and I think, man, this is a great series. I would like to read this again. But then I look at that last puzzle piece and I kind of don't want to. There are many other manga like this where its best asset is actually one of the things that pulls it downwards because it doesn't live up to the expectations of the audience as well as what was laid out for us. Claymore is a similar series in that way. It has an element to it of mystery that is really intriguing and really, really interesting, but it doesn't live up to its own expectations, and it's dumbfounded me to this day. I do think it's a great series though and would recommend it. But one of the problems I have with it is its core mystery. Claymore here is an action shonen battle manga in a medieval setting. Because of this, it has earned its nickname Berserk with Hot Tall Girls, which, so far, very good. I do enjoy this series a lot and would recommend it. But there's one little problem I have with it. Our protagonist is Claire. She's a warrior, also known as a claymore, who wanders the land hunting Yoma. Yoma are these demon-like monsters that feed on human intestines and flesh. Infused with the power of Yoma, claymores make a living killing these monsters and getting paid by the local people. The organization that they work through is just a mysterious organization that you don't really know a lot about throughout the story. In fact, you also don't know where Yoma came from. It's never really talked about. Where they came from, how they came to be, and where this organization started. Spoilers! It turns out that the organization that created the Claymores are also the people who created the Yoma. The land they're living on is actually a testing ground to breed even stronger inhuman soldiers for these warring nations on a landmass far across the sea. A place with their own wars, nations, characters, cultures, all of these things that you'll never get to see. The downside of this mystery is that it is brought up and that's it. If you got rid of the mystery of the organization of a different nation and came up with something else completely different that didn't involve a nation across the seas, the outcome of the story would be exactly the same. This is one of the reasons why I wouldn't want to read Claymore again, mostly because it feels like it didn't have an impact on the story in any meaningful way. It was a driving mystery, but it never really lived up to what it felt like it was meant to be. Obviously, it's not the main goal or motivation of the main character to find out this mystery, but it's something that does perplex all the characters, and it does lend itself to the world building. If I attempt another read through, all I would think is, what else was happening in this other nation beyond the sea? How do our characters fit into that? By making your world feel larger, you also risk making the story you tell feel that much smaller. The story of characters trying to find their family is suddenly no longer the focus and doesn't feel like the bigger issue. And instead, it's being obscured by this mystery that was pivotal to a plot, but not the plot. When I say never read again, I don't also mean exclusively just endings. I also mean other parts of stories, whether they are successes or failures. How many of you really like JoJo? I myself have only read part 1, Phantom Blood, and hope to maybe make a JoJo video soon if I can get into the other parts and continue reading. The reason I haven't is because part 1 was okay. It was okay. It was interesting, but it didn't make me really want to read part 2. And at this point, I still haven't. And what's funny is that when I asked friends who have read or watched JoJo, and even looked online on the general consensus of certain parts, everyone says how much part 1 and even part 2 are a slog. This collective understanding that part 1 is a slog and actually a hard entry point for newcomers, especially when it's the beginning of the story. A bad beginning, a narrative stumble, can be something that stops you from ever wanting to go even further in the story if what you experience doesn't feel good, complete, ready, or finished. And even if you are a fan of JoJo and you've probably read all of it, you might go back to part 1 and wonder what it was that was interesting in the first place that made you want to keep reading. If you were someone who was a newcomer and looked at part 1, would you even want to read it again? And if you are reading from the start, do you remember how much of a grind or a slog it was to read part 1? I've talked to some friends and some people who read and watch JoJo, and a lot of them always say if they ever want to rewatch or reread parts, they never go back to part 1. Instead, opting to a point where the story has found its footing and has become JoJo. I found skipping the entry points of stories when you're rereading or trying to re-experience a story is that skipping the start is kind of like getting off Tutorial Island and straight into the main content. And don't get me started on grind, because when you're a manga reader like me, it's a grind sometimes. There is some value in that though. Stories that go on for hundreds upon hundreds of chapters to get to some great crucial point of the plot and character development can feel so much more satisfying because you put in the time. You've put in the effort to understand these characters, and obviously, if you kept reading, it was good along the way. You can akin this to similar stuff in stories like One Piece. Look at how hyped people are for a big character revelation or change. I mean, you just have to look at Gear 5 to see that. People spend hours upon hours reading and watching this story to see a huge moment in the story unfold. Now, I don't know the historical value or the lore value of this transformation or why it matters so much. One Piece fans, this is your chance to comment. Please let me know. Love to hear it. Helps the algorithm a lot. I'll definitely read it. That moment took place in episode 1071 of the anime and chapter 1044 of the manga. If I told you to re-experience that scene, but to do it, you have to rewatch all of One Piece and reread it all, would you? I know there's one of you out there who said yes. I'm not someone who reads or watches One Piece yet, but I know people who do. And from what I hear, there is a lot of quality. Can you read it all again for the pure sake of enjoyment? Can all of this, even though you've experienced it once, be just as good as when you read it the first time, especially in such an abundance? As someone who's made a lot of Berserk videos on this channel, the amount of times I've reread Berserk is twice. I never go back to reread from the beginning. I only went back to reread parts that were in the story that I knew I needed to re-educate myself on. Now, are these chapters good enough that make me want to kind of keep reading from where I left off? Kinda, yeah, but at the same time, I don't want to reread everything I know about this constantly. Honestly, the more I reread it, the more magic kind of disappears because I know even more and more to the exact dialogue what's going to happen next. And that isn't as good as you might think it is. To kind of wrap this all around, I need to go back to Downfall. In the story, as it unfolds, Fukuzawa starts to realize that the life he's living now is a life that he doesn't want. And in fact, he starts to blame others for it. All the people who are excited for what he's going to make next, whether it be his wife, his editors, his fans, are the people he blames for the state his life is in. Despite choosing this for himself, he just wants to push it onto other people. This is why he finds joy in being with people who don't know who he is. Much of the story of Downfall has been somewhat theorized as being autobiographical. The look and similarities of Asano to his main character I think were intentional. It's kind of showcasing the person that Asano himself could have been that you might never know. Nearing the end of the story, Fukuzawa himself does and says some really awful things, especially to the people who do give a shit about him. He even separates from his wife, who dropped all her work to try and save their marriage. And if you were thinking she was cheating, no, she wasn't. She just really loves manga. Ultimately, the manga itself ends on a weirdly positive, turned cynical note. At the end, Fukuzawa finally decides to make a new series, and at the launch of the first volume, it's a smash success. And a long-term fan comes up to him to get her volume signed. She tells him how much her stories meant to her, how much of her life felt less lonely because of the stories he made, how much his words and his characters made her feel less alone and got her through some really awful times. I think if you're someone who reads a lot of manga, or you consume a lot of stories that may be considered introverted, you probably have felt this way before, where there was a story or there was a medium that made you feel less lonely. Fukuzawa is taken aback by this, and he's so shocked that he begins to weep in front of her. And as he weeps, he utters words that I wasn't expecting. He simply says to her, "She doesn't understand anything." Of the manga I've talked about on this list, some of you may disagree. Of course you can reread these stories again. There's nothing stopping you from doing so. There is so much manga out there that we can just consume as much as we want, and there's no limit to how much we do. But manga like Downfall are different from all the others I've talked about in this video, mostly because of the intention that it has for its reader. It is the most perplexing because it makes you feel the worst of emotions, and any hope of anything good happening from these stories is most definitely unlikely, kind of reflecting what true life is: unexpected, unfair, and at oftentimes depressing. I have talked about this in some videos in a small way when discussing the demographics in manga. If you want to read something entertaining, looking at something that was created in the shonen or even shoujo demographic is probably where you should start for just pure entertainment. But if you want something that can reflect reality in a less picturesque way, demographics like seinen and josei are probably where these stories live. The question is, would I ever want to read stories like Downfall ever again? And why would you? There is something to be said about people who love to consume very dark, interesting, and introverted stories that make you feel not great. There are people who love to consume Evangelion, and there are people who like Evangelion but wouldn't want to consume it again. I would fall into the latter. When I watched the Evangelion movie, End of Evangelion, there was stuff that I saw, and the culmination of images and sounds and choices that these characters made me so unnerved. It's a great film. I would definitely recommend watching it, especially if you like Evangelion and you just like anime in general. But it was something that made me feel very not okay with being a human being. And there aren't many stories that can do that. I think the difference is that as someone who has felt pretty good about where I am in my life, at least in who I am, I can look at that and find the negative aspects of myself in these characters. And so I'd rather look away. Whereas people who don't see a lot of things about themselves that they like probably look at these characters and relate more to them. And that's a very interesting discussion argument to have about whether or not that's healthy. Whether or not you should be in a bad state of mind to enjoy these stories more. Some of the best stories you will ever consume are because you're not in a great state of mind, and that's why they spoke to you. If you like Evangelion because you were in a rut and it pulled you out because you related to it, we wouldn't want you to be in that rut again just to enjoy it. The same way I wouldn't want to be in a bad state of mind just to enjoy stories like Downfall. End of Evangelion was one of the most horrific interpretations of human choice and human consciousness I had ever seen. And it's not really a movie I would recommend to watch on the first day or even watching with the family after absolutely smashing at Monopoly. What I think Downfall says to me that makes me a bit uncomfortable is showing someone who succeeded so much in their creative field that they became an extremely unlikable and ugly version of themselves that they even couldn't see. Making content is fun. Doing it part-time for the past year and a half is really enjoyable to me. But reading Downfall kind of made me think of artistic expression in a weird way, where if I get so obsessed with reaching a goal, like this channel, I don't want to end up like this guy. The thought of something that I used to express myself changing me is actually really terrifying. I think it's one of the reasons why the ending of this story unnerved me so much. So let me tell you what happens. The ending of the story shows Fukuzawa when he's still in university working as a mangaka assistant. It's around the time he has a chance to make his own series, and he's walking with his girlfriend at the time. He's complaining about a coworker who says that he doesn't truly love manga, and his girlfriend decides to confront him about it. She says that Fukuzawa believes that he is actually above others, and that if he continues down this road of making manga, he will become worse, and in the end become a monster. This dual ending of Fukuzawa at his signing and him when he was younger kinda shows the reader what Asano's trying to say. As long as I sell copies and make a story that you will love and consume, and that speaks to you, I could be the worst human being on this planet. This is the last scene of the manga, and Fukuzawa, when recalling this memory, says this: "I felt something like a murderous impulse quietly race through me. How ugly was the version of me reflected in her eyes." The final panel is Fukuzawa staring back at us, finally seeing him how others saw him. And that's why this is a manga I can never read again. Manga are dynamic like that, and they can have the exact intended effect even in their adaptations. It's as amazing as it is shocking and hard to look at. And just like a panel I don't want to see again, and the stories maybe I don't want to go through again, who knows? Something might happen where I have to, and something might happen where I'll find another one. Thank you all for watching, and I appreciate it if you made it to the end. I also want to say thank you to everyone who subscribed. At the time of recording, we hit over 15,000 subscribers. Shows that you guys are enjoying what I'm making, and I really appreciate the support. And if you do want to support, you've never seen me before, leave a like, subscribe, all that usual shit. And if you're someone who's been around for a while, I've actually have another channel where I just post some gaming stuff. I recently made a video about why Baldur's Gate 3 has kind of caused a ruckus in the gaming industry. But that's all from me. I appreciate you for watching till the end again. My name's Mugen, as always. Have a good one.